Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today our topic is France under Napoleon III, so the Second Empire, and also life in middle 19th century Europe. We talked about the neighbors of France. We talked about the situation in Italy, unification of Italy. We talked about unification of Germany. So these are people that Napoleon III would have to interact. He did interact. And we will, the only other thing you remember is that he comes to power in 1848 after the revolution, primarily because of what we would call today the name recognition. Uh, Everybody knew Napoleon. The monarchy was so totally discredited after Louis XVIII and then Charles II, Charles X, and then Louis the Citizen King. So monarchy was no longer popular. Uh, the republic was something that was definitely come back, and but the problem was, as you recall, in 1848 there was this division of France into more radical and less radical elements, and the experience of national workshops was very important because it sort of created the idea that the government should take care of the workers. But at the same time, the Cavagnac's really brutal suppression of the revolution and violence in the streets of Paris, it also created a kind of a bad taste, a kind of a division of society, which was very fortunate for Bonaparte because he could claim as to be a kind of a moderating person between the monarchies, as he would be kind of like a empire. Empire was always kind of associated with the good times, with the grandeur of France, and of course using the name Napoleon and being associated with Napoleon was something that was just right at the right time. But he was also positioning himself as a republican. Nobody knew he was going to proclaim himself an emperor. So he was a candidate as a republican. Obviously, he would prevail over somebody like Cavaignac, who was you know, was bloody hands. I mean, the guy was suppressing and killing people. So this kind of all of that was very fortunate situation, and he wins the presidency. But then 3 years go by, and it's a 4-year term. There's a legislative assembly, and things are not looking good. He cannot run for the second term. So he's beginning to think of how he could stay in power. And of course, the example that he has, the big figure that is always overshadowing his life, is his great uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, what Napoleon Bonaparte did in the tough situation was to seize power by a coup d'etat. And this is exactly what Napoleon III wants to do. He does imitate, in many ways, he does imitate his uncle. So what he's particularly attentive to, just like Napoleon, the real Napoleon as I call him, is public opinion. He's kind of feeling out public opinion, which way he is a politician. He does play up to the public. He does know how to prepare a good speech, how to appear and shake hands at the right place. He is a very skillful politician. I do not deny that he is a skillful politician. Maybe not a skillful statesman, but a skillful politician. So he does project this image, and he does prepare a coup d'etat, and finally he does seize power, but it's not as easy as it turned out to be for his uncle. There is resistance. There are hundreds and thousands of people who had to be arrested and exiled. Nevertheless, he does repeat the same trick that Napoleon Bonaparte did, that is to go to the plebiscite. And in order to approve, to get the approval rating, he does a very clever thing. He announces that there will be universal suffrage as opposed to limited suffrage in the preceding regime. And that makes like it's a democracy, and he wins. So he does create a new legislative assembly that is based on universal suffrage, but of course he has, as a head of state, an upper hand over this. So he does win, but he's very careful, and he's, for the rest of his reign, he is trying very hard and will do some important things to cater to the workers and to the middle class and to the public opinion and to be a political emperor. Just like Napoleon Bonaparte took great care to have good press coverage and to have support of the people and winning those plebiscites or referenda. And then the next year he had another referendum and it also worked fine. So he felt quite secure in his position in the early 1850s. Now, about his domestic policy, basically, what could we say about Napoleon's policy? I want to focus on the good things. Probably following Bismarck, probably on his own, he does initiate a number of very positive legislation and reforms in terms of social services for the workers. One thing that would only the socialists in Russia would implement in 1917, the Mensheviks, was the joint boards of the employers and employees. It's a great idea. Probably he heard of Marx and the class struggle ideas and stuff like that, and he felt, well, maybe they should work out things together. So he does institute these kind of negotiations that are still a part of French scene today, negotiations between the factory owners and the workers. So that's one thing. He also introduces that probably is before Bismarck, social legislation in terms of mutual boards, insurance, unemployment, old age compensation, all kinds of things to cater to the workers, which were on the program of the socialists. And he's trying to come across as the fair emperor who loves the French people, who takes care of them, and that does pay off. He does, especially in the 1850s, the first decade of his rule is quite popular. Genuinely, there is a genuine support in his social policy. Probably is the best thing that he did. Now, about the second part of the social policy has to be addressed, and that is called Hausmanization. Hausmanization comes from the word Hausmann, and Hausmann is an architect. And today, the way you see Paris today is pretty much the work of Hausmann. Paris didn't look like that at all. The entire central part of Paris, what we associate with Paris, the avenues, the l'Opéra, and the Avenue de Capucine, and the Étoile, and the straight lines of avenues going in all directions, and the French balconies, and street lined with street lights and trees, and squares and things. All of that is the work of Haussmann. This is what Hausmanization is a reconstruction of Paris. But not only of Paris, but it's a kind of a revolution in urban planning. Now, the way Paris used to look is pretty much the left bank, which is a maze of crooked streets, total chaos with traffic and narrow passages and poor neighborhoods and tenements and things like that. So today, of course, it's very, very expensive and very fancy with millions of restaurants and tourists. But that's not the way it was. Left bank was poor, and the right bank, this is where the l'Opéra and the Étoile and all the avenues are. This is where the rich people lived. And this is all reconstructed into this new French style of urban planning. Now, the reason we have used this Hausmanization is that it's not only in Paris, and it also is a modern architecture. It also is what you could call triumph of the bourgeoisie, which means of the, in politically correct British English, middle classes. They're kind of like in the middle. They're actually upper classes, but politically correct to say that they're middle. So who are the bourgeoisie? They're the well-to-do. They're the educated societies. They're the lawyers and the shopkeepers and the property owners and those people who are well-dressed, who go to the promenades in the boulevards along the Seine, in the Bois de Boulogne. I mean, that is a kind of a middle of the 19th century French lifestyle that is associated with the bourgeoisie, with well-being, with happy kind of a Parisian lifestyle full of light and painting and love and music. That is something that this image of Paris did appear under the reign of Napoleon III and is connected with Hausmanization. Now, obviously, this is also the time of the beginning of the French dominance of arts. This is just the very beginning of the what would be known later as the Impressionists and the great French school of painting, which also comes with a certain style of living, with the salon, with the exhibitions, with the restaurants, with cafes, with street life, with music, with opera, with concerts. You know, opera is completely Italian, but then sort of French one begins to appear. Now, all of that is what we call Hausmanization. All of that is what we call French lifestyle of the bourgeoisie. This is, of course, very different from the life of the poor people, so well described by Émile Zola in many of his novels, and of course Victor Hugo, the Miserables. So you have this kind of a double picture of French society. On the one hand, Les Miserables, the poor tenements and hungry workers and the awful conditions that are so well described by Émile Zola in the factories. On the other hand, you have the haute bourgeoisie and the middle bourgeoisie that are enjoying life. They're going for promenades and restaurants and operas and receptions and salons, and basically Paris is the capital of Europe one more time in culture. Berlin and Vienna and St. Petersburg are going to match it up very quickly, and they will be four cultural capitals of Europe in that order: Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. By the turn of the century, St. Petersburg would be pretty much taking over, but that's a separate story. So that is what we call Hausmanization. That is what we call middle class culture, or the culture of bourgeoisie that is so much associated with the age of Napoleon III. Marriage and family. What is new about this time? Marriage and family is becoming important, is becoming bourgeois. In a sense, it's much more open, it's much more relaxed than it was at the time of aristocratic unions for money and money only. And it is becoming what we would sort of recognize as today's standards, more or less. That you have a normal family, that you have children, that the parents take care of them, that they live in apartments. If you're well-to-do, you have apartment buildings with 5, 6, 7-room apartments. If you're poor, you live in the upper floors and you have 1 or 2-room apartments. There's also boarding houses for single people. So in other words, daily life does begin to look similar somewhat to the one in the 20th century. Now, obviously, there are social ills that are also well described in the grain-fed literature, which is prostitution and poverty and crime, and the poor artist who lives in some kind of a mansard in the 5th floor. All of that is a part of French life, which is so well discussed in French literature. Now, let me focus a little bit on foreign policy of Napoleon III. Which can be focused on, his interactions, which is Britain, Germany, Italy, and Russia. So that would be the way to look at it. The first one would be the Crimean War, and that is very important, as we discussed, because Britain lures France into its embrace. And there's a kind of a beginning of a long-term relationship where they are more or less allies. And the reason I say more or less is we could see there were a couple of tension points between them that almost came to war in Africa, but still, there's a kind of a joint venture initiated by England. France gets on board to attack Russia in Crimea. Crimean War is an invasion of Russian territory by Britain and France in order to knock out Russia out of the Mediterranean, which is actually a British agenda. The French just kind of go along in this venture because they want to do things together with the British in the Mediterranean basin. So the war basically goes badly for both sides, but in the end, after very bloody, very long battle, Sevastopol, the Russian port city, is taken by the French and the British. Peace is signed, and Russia is deprived from access to the Mediterranean Sea, which is exactly what the British wanted, to have a free hand in the Mediterranean. And then their next target is another joint project with the French, which is the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal was built by the French, but in a nutshell, the British duped the British out of it, the French out of it. So the French built it, the British took it over. Which was, of course, a very smart move on the part of Disraeli. It's one of his greatest feats, the British Prime Minister, but it was also one of the defeats out of many of Napoleon Bonaparte. For our purposes of discussion of his policy, the main point is anything he touched in foreign policy was a disaster. That's what I'm trying to say. Including the war in Crimea, which really was a very bloody mess, with no particular gains for France. Suez becomes British, and then the British are trying to cater to the interests of the French in the Mediterranean, giving them all kinds of things like in Syria, the patronage of the Christians in Syria, and more and more and more, and encourage them to expand from Algeria towards Morocco, which they did, but the Berbers of Morocco put an end to these in their chaotic ways to stop the French advancement in the 60s. And it would take only until the end of the century when the British would deliver Morocco to France, again for the same purposes of keeping them on board as their allies. So this is the briefly relations with Britain. The second one that you already know about is the relationship with Italy, which is a deal with Cavour against Austria. And that was fairly successful, Napoleon Bonaparte, for Napoleon III, because he did get something for France. He did get Savoy, and he did get Nice, and then he concluded peace at the right time, but he could not prevent unification of Italy, and he wanted to keep Italy as it was, but that didn't work out. So in that sense, he did fail. Now, and finally, the most important relationship is that with with Prussia, and that is over the issue of German unification, where it was blunder after blunder. The first blunder of Napoleon was when he failed to support Austria, when Austria was fighting Prussia in 1866. He just stayed out of it. And then the second one, he did bite on the bait that was set up for him by Bismarck in the Elms telegram, when he didn't manage to control French public opinion and did declare war on Prussia, which is exactly what Bismarck wanted him to do. In other words, Bismarck outsmarted him, and he got into a trap, and he did declare war, which was a catastrophe that ended up with the Battle of Sedan, where he is taken prisoner of war, his army is defeated, France is humiliated, France loses Alsace-Lorraine, and that's the end of the empire and the end of his rule. So this was very much the end of it. So let me do one sentence assessment. Was this a successful reign or not? In terms of foreign policy, absolutely not. It was everything he touched, including Mexico affair, which is a separate story, is a disaster. But in terms of the l'esprit de temps, in terms of the spirit of the times, this was good for France. This was the beginning of the French preeminence in the arts and in the lifestyle. And just like in the 18th century, when France was lingua franca, this time around, France begins to be an attractive proposition, with the happy people and the balanced power between the rich and the poor, with overcoming contradictions, and essentially Paris does begin to shine again. And in that sense, it was a good time for France. Thank you. Don't forget to sign up for my videos.